Everyone knows the heroic version. A narrow ribbon of water cut through the jungle of Central America. 51 miles that joined two oceans and shaved thousands of miles off the voyage from New York to San Francisco. The triumph of American engineering, American medicine, American will. The mosquitoes conquered, the mountains moved, a shortcut for the whole of world trade, carved by the nation bold enough to finish what France could not. That is the story on the plaque. That is the story in the textbook. And almost none of it is a lie. But it is the wrong story. Because before a single American shovel bit into Panamanian earth, the decisive battle had already been fought and won, not in the jungle, but in the marble corridors of Washington, in the private offices of New York, and inside the ledgers of a bankrupt French company that was desperate above all else to be paid. Picture a room in the State Department. It is November 1903. Secretary of State John Hay sits across from a single man, and together they sign a treaty that creates the relationship between the United States and a country that is 15 days old. The treaty hands America a strip of land 10 miles wide from ocean to ocean to hold and govern in perpetuity. And the man signing on behalf of the new Republic of Panama is not Panamanian. He is a French engineer named Philippe Bunau-Varilla, who has not lived in Panama for roughly 17 years, who holds a large block of stock in the very company about to be paid, and who will, after this afternoon, never set foot in the country, whose sovereignty he has just given away. The official Panamanian delegation, the men actually sent to negotiate their own nation's future, are still on a train. They arrive in Washington roughly 2 hours too late. No Panamanian signed the document that defined Panama. So here's the question the plaque never asks. If this was a story about engineering, why does it turn at every single hinge on money, on a $40 million sale, on an $800,000 commission, on a Wall Street lawyer and a French shareholder who needed one specific outcome and were willing to help invent a country to get it? The version in the textbooks leaves out the most important chapter. Here's the full story. Because the real engine of the Panama Canal was never steel or steam. It was money, and specifically the frantic need of a failed French company to sell a graveyard of rusting machinery to the United States Treasury before its legal right to do so expired. Everything else, the revolution, the gunboat, the treaty signed by a man who was not Panamanian, was built on top of that single financial imperative. The lobbyists had a product to move worth $40 million and a deadline. The United States wanted a canal and a cheaper route. Colombia stood between them, and so Colombia was removed, not conquered, not defeated. Removed the way an obstacle is removed from a balance sheet. This is the chapter you were not taught, not how America built the canal, but how America bought the right to build it and who got paid. To understand what the United States was buying, you first have to understand the catastrophe it was buying it from. And here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The dream did not begin in America. It began with Ferdinand de Lesseps, the Frenchman who had already achieved the impossible once. In 1869, he opened the Suez Canal, and it made him the most celebrated man in France, a promoter, a fundraiser, a visionary who could walk into a room of skeptics and leave with their signatures. Between 1879 and 1881, he launched the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique de Panama to cut a sea-level channel across the isthmus just as he had at Suez, and ordinary France believed him. The company raised roughly 1.5 billion francs. Not from banks, but from the savings of about 800,000 small French investors, including a figure often cited as some 15,000 single women who trusted the hero of Suez. With everything they had, Panama was not Egypt. It was a wall of jungle and swamp and flooding rivers, and it was ruled by two invisible killers no one yet understood: yellow fever and falciparum malaria. The connection between mosquitoes and disease had not yet been proven. That would come only around 1900, when Walter Reed's team confirmed the theory the Cuban doctor Carlos Finlay had proposed 2 decades earlier. Until then, the French fought the fevers blind, and their own remedies could make things worse. At the company hospital at Ancon, to keep ants off the sick, the legs of the beds were stood in bowls of water, which became perfect nurseries for the very mosquitoes carrying the fever from cot to cot. The building meant to heal the workers helped kill them. Modern estimates put the death toll of the French effort in the 1880s at somewhere around 20,000 men, with some figures reaching 22,000, and I want to be precise here, no single audited number exists, the estimates vary, and roughly 20,000 is the figure most commonly cited today. What is not in dispute is the scale of the human wreckage, and the fevers were only half the catastrophe. The other half was a decision made in a lecture hall in Paris. De Lesseps had beaten the desert at Suez by digging at sea level, a straight channel scraped through flat sand, and he was certain the same method would beat the jungle. He insisted on a sea-level canal at Panama. No locks, no dams, just a trench cut clean from ocean to ocean. But Panama was neither flat nor dry. The route had to pass through the Continental Divide at a ridge called the Culebra Cut, and the deeper the French dug, the more the rain-soaked hillsides slid back down into the trench. Landslides swallowed in a single night what had taken months to remove. By early 1883, the company had excavated only a small fraction of the earth de Lesseps had promised. And slicing across the path was the Chagres River, which in the rainy season could rise as much as 30 feet in a matter of hours, turning the entire worksite into a brown torrent. Engineers on the ground pleaded with him to switch to a lock canal, a staircase of water that would lift ships over the mountains instead of cutting through them. He refused for years. Only in 1888, with the money nearly gone, did he finally hire Gustave Eiffel, fresh from his tower, to begin building locks. By then, it was far too late. The financial wreckage came next. On the 4th of February, 1889, a Paris court placed the company into liquidation. The savings of those 800,000 investors simply vanished. And then, in the autumn of 1892, the newspapers La Libre Parole and La Cocarde exposed what had been done to hide the collapse. Company directors had bribed government officials to keep the money flowing after the project was already doomed. Investigators would allege that the bribes reached more than 100 members of the Chamber of Deputies. It became the largest financial corruption scandal of 19th century France. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the hero of Suez, died on December 7, 1894, a broken and disgraced man. And here is the critical detail that changes everything. The failure left behind a corpse, but the corpse was worth something. It left behind a legal concession, the right to build across Panama, and a mountain of equipment and excavation. In 1894, a successor was formed to hold those assets, the Compagnie Nouvelle du Canal de Panama, the new Panama Canal Company. Its entire reason to exist was to sell what the old company had left before the Colombian concession ran out. It was a company built to liquidate, and a company built to liquidate needs one thing above all others, a buyer with deep pockets. There was only one on earth. Which brings us to the two men who turned a fire sale into a foreign policy. And here, the pace changes entirely. The first was Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer who had worked on de Lesseps' doomed project as a young man, and who now held a large amount of stock in the new company. His money was in Panama. If the canal were built anywhere else, his shares became waste paper. The second was William Nelson Cromwell, a Wall Street lawyer, a partner at the firm Sullivan and Cromwell, counsel to the new company, and this matters, a donor to the Republican Party. And not a modest one. During the presidential campaign of 1900, Cromwell handed $60,000 to the Republican National Committee, a sum he quietly charged back to the new company's account. He handed it to the one man who could turn money into policy, Senator Mark Hanna of Ohio, Republican kingmaker and the party's chairman. In return, the Republican platform was written to call for an Isthmian canal, not pointedly a Nicaraguan one as the Democrats had specified, leaving Panama alive as a possibility. Hanna would go on to become the new company's most powerful voice inside the Senate. Cromwell understood a truth that no engineering report could capture. In Washington, the right conversation at the right dinner, the right check to the right committee was worth more than 1,000 pages of survey data. Their goal was singular and specific. Get the United States to buy the French assets for $40 million, and get it to choose Panama over Nicaragua. For his labors on behalf of the new company, Cromwell is reported to have received a commission of roughly $800,000, a staggering fee for the era, though I should note the exact figure varies across sources and the precise basis has never been firmly settled. But the order of magnitude tells you what was at stake. This was not diplomacy, it was salesmanship, with a nation's map as the product. And they had a problem, because America did not want Panama, it wanted Nicaragua. That is the mini cliffhanger the heroic version erases entirely. For most of the 19th century, Nicaragua was the assumed route for an American canal. The geography seemed friendlier, the politics seemed calmer. When the Walker Commission, formerly the Isthmian Canal Commission, studied the options, it spent 2 years in the field and then reported formally that Nicaragua was the most practicable and favorable route. And its reasoning was coldly financial. The French were asking somewhere around $109 to $110 million for their Panama assets. At that price, Panama was absurd. Nicaragua won on arithmetic. So Cromwell and Bunau-Varilla changed the arithmetic. The new company slashed its price to $40 million. Bunau-Varilla's argument to his fellow shareholders being blunt, the Colombian concession was about to expire, and after that, their stock was worth nothing at all. Overnight, the calculus inverted, and once the price collapsed, Roosevelt summoned the commissioners of the Walker Commission and let it be known what he wanted. They produced a supplementary report, this one unanimous for Panama. The experts had not changed their science. They had only changed their answer. In June of 1902, Congress passed, and Theodore Roosevelt signed into law on the 28th the Spooner Act. It authorized the purchase of the new Panama Canal Company's assets for up to $40 million and the building of a Panama Canal, but only if a satisfactory treaty could be obtained with Colombia, which then owned Panama. If not, the United States would turn to Nicaragua. The door to Panama was open, but it was held open by a single hinge, Colombia's consent. And the case for Panama had a co-author in the Senate. On the 5th of June 1902, Hanna delivered a long, plain, devastatingly effective speech for the rout, propping up maps that marked Nicaragua's volcanoes in red ink and left Panama conspicuously blank. His colleagues took to calling the whole business the Panama Canal. And then came the postage stamps. On June 16, 1902, 3 days before the Senate would vote, Bunau-Varilla did something that belongs in a manual on lobbying. To frighten senators away from Nicaragua, he mailed each of them a Nicaraguan postage stamp, a stamp that happened to depict the volcano Momotombo in smoking eruption, under a typed caption calling it an official witness of the volcanic activity on the Isthmus of Nicaragua. Momotombo had, in fact, stirred to life that spring. Here, he was saying, is your proof, printed by Nicaragua's own government. This land is seismic, unstable, unfit for a canal. Panama has no such volcanoes. It was theater, and it worked well enough. The Senate voted for the Panama route on June 19th by a margin of just 8 votes. A stamp helped decide the route of world trade. But a route is not a canal, and Colombia still had to say yes. Which brings us to the treaty that broke everything. On the 22nd of January 1903, Secretary of State John Hay and the Colombian chargé d'affaires, Hay-Herran, signed the Hay-Herran Treaty. Its terms, a $10 million lump sum to Colombia plus $250,000 a year for the concession. The United States Senate approved it in March. And then on the 12th of August 1903, the Colombian Senate rejected it, unanimously. Not out of caprice. Colombia wanted more money and greater sovereignty, and it could do arithmetic of its own. It knew that the French concession would soon expire, and that if it simply waited, the $40 million America was about to hand French shareholders might instead be negotiated toward Colombia. It was a rational calculation by a sovereign nation exercising a sovereign right. Theodore Roosevelt did not see it that way. He saw an obstacle. He would later privately deride the Colombian legislators in language of open contempt. And now the Spooner Act's clock was ticking. No treaty with Colombia meant the canal went to Nicaragua, and Bunau-Varilla's shares in Cromwell's $40 million sale evaporated with it. Everything the lobbyists had built came down to one fact: Colombia had said no. So the men who needed a yes went looking for a different Panama, one that would sign, and here is where the threads converge, on the isthmus itself. Separatist feeling in Panama was real and old. The province was neglected by distant Bogotá, and it had tried to break away before. That genuine grievance became the raw material for something engineered from outside. Bunau-Varilla positioned himself at the center of a planned revolt, offering money, offering assurance that the United States would shield it, and Washington did exactly that. Panama declared independence from Colombia on the 3rd of November, 1903. But the decisive actor was not a Panamanian rifleman, it was a warship. The USS Nashville had steamed into Cologne on November 2nd, and American commanders, citing the 1846 Mallarino-Bidlack Treaty, an old agreement meant to guarantee free transit across the isthmus, moved to keep the railroad clear. Colombia had, in fact, rushed reinforcements. Some 500 men of the Tiradores Battalion, hastily assembled conscripts, landed at Cologne aboard the cruiser Cartagena and the steamer Alexander Bixio, under Generals Juan Tovar and Ramon Amaya. They had arrived in time to crush the revolt. They never got the chance. The superintendent of the Panama Railroad, an American, Colonel James Shaler, greeted the generals with great courtesy and offered them a single passenger car to ride ahead to Panama City, where, on arrival, they were promptly arrested by the rebels. Their leaderless troops sat stranded on the Atlantic coast, a full mountain range away from the revolution they had come to stop. The colonel left in command at Colón, Eliseo Torres, was isolated, without orders from Bogotá or anyone else, and was, in the end, paid $8,000 in gold to load his men back onto a ship and sail home. The whole revolution cost almost no blood at all. When the Colombian gunboat Bogotá lobbed a few shells into Panama City, the only fatalities recorded were a shopkeeper and a donkey. A nation had been subtracted from another nation, and the body count was 2. Then came the speed that gives this whole affair away. Roosevelt's administration recognized the Republic of Panama on the 6th of November, 1903, 3 days after the declaration. No sovereign ally of half a century was ever discarded so fast, and no infant nation was ever embraced so quickly. The recognition was not a response to events. It was the plan. And the new government, floated on foreign money and foreign protection, made a foreign man its voice. It appointed Philippe Bunau-Varilla, the Frenchman, the shareholder, the man who had not lived there in some 17 years, as Panama's minister plenipotentiary to the United States. The country was 2 days old, and its diplomat was a French canal investor with 40 million reasons to close the deal. He closed it fast. On the 18th of November 1903, in Washington, John Hay and Bunau-Varilla signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty before the official Panamanian delegation, including Manuel Amador Guerrero and Federico Boyd, could reach the city. They arrived roughly 2 hours too late, and the terms Bunau-Varilla accepted were, by design, worse for Panama than the ones Colombia had rejected as insulting. The United States received a canal zone 10 miles wide, 5 miles on either side of the canal, to control in perpetuity, with rights comparable to a sovereign. Panama received the same $10 million and $250,000 a year that had been offered to Colombia, with the annuity not even beginning until 9 years after signing. A smaller, weaker party had been given terms more favorable to Washington than the ones a larger nation had walked away from. Bunau-Varilla had not been negotiating for Panama. He had been negotiating for the $40 million and for the men who would receive it. Now follow the money to its destination, because this is the part the brochure will never show you. In 1904, the United States paid the $40 million to the new Panama Canal Company for the French assets. As the historian David McCullough documents in his definitive account, The Path Between the Seas, it was the largest real estate transaction in history to that date, dwarfing the $7.2 million America had paid Russia for the whole of Alaska in 1867. It was the largest treasury warrant the United States had ever issued. And whose name was on that warrant? Not the government's alone. The arrangement had been set even before the treaty was signed, by a letter dated the November 17, 1903. The day before Hay and Bunau-Varilla put their names to the document, J.P. Morgan and Company had been made the fiscal agent of the infant Republic of Panama, with the exclusive power to collect whatever sum the United States would pay. So the Treasury made the warrant out to J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, New York City, special disbursing agent. In late April of 1904, Morgan personally oversaw the transfer. His bank shipped roughly $18 million in gold bullion across the Atlantic to Paris, and bought exchange on Paris for the balance. On the 2nd of May, the money was paid into the Banque de France to the account of the new company and the liquidator of de Lesseps' old Compagnie Universelle. For handling the single largest payment the American government had ever made, Morgan's fee, charged, fittingly, to the French company, came to $35,000. A week later, on the 9th of May, the United States Treasury reimbursed the House of Morgan its $40 million in full. If you want to know what the Panama Canal was really about, that warrant is your answer. It is not an engineering document. It is a receipt. Roosevelt, for his part, never hid his pride in the method. At the University of California, Berkeley, on March 23, 1911, the Charter Day address, he laid the thing bare. If he had done it the conservative way, he told the students, submitting a 200-page state paper to Congress and waiting for the debate, that debate would still be going on at this very moment, and the digging would be 50 years in the future. And so, in the words printed from that speech, accordingly I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me. The same address is remembered, too, in a punchier and more famous form. I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does also. Both renderings come from that one afternoon in Berkeley, and both say the same thing. He took the isthmus, his own word, not built, not negotiated, took. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a subject where the documented record and the darker legend sit dangerously close together, and where an honest telling has to separate the two. Everything I have described so far is documented. The $40 million purchase, J.P., Morgan as disbursing agent, Cromwell and Bunau-Varilla's lobbying, the reported $800,000 commission, Colombia's rejection, the shielded revolution, the recognition in 3 days, the treaty signed by a Frenchman before Panama's own delegation arrived. That is the record. But there is a further, much heavier charge that is not proven, and I will not present it as if it were. In 1908 and 1909, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and the Indianapolis News published a sensational allegation that a secret American syndicate had quietly bought up cheap shares in the new company and pocketed a huge hidden slice of the $40 million, a group said to include relatives of the men in power, among them Roosevelt's brother-in-law Douglas Robinson and William Howard Taft's brother Charles P. Taft. The world charged that this syndicate had made huge profits from the sale. Roosevelt was enraged, and he did something extraordinary. He pushed federal criminal libel prosecutions against the newspapers. Those prosecutions collapsed. In United States versus Press Publishing Company, decided in 1911, the Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of the indictments, largely on jurisdictional grounds. And here's the essential point. The profiteering was never proven, not in that court, not in any official inquiry. Who ultimately received the $40 million, and whether any American speculators had quietly acquired French shares beforehand to skim it, was never fully documented. The claim that half the money vanished into a private American group remains a documented accusation and an unproven one. I flag it as exactly that, and no more. So what is the real lesson here? The one that outlives the stamps and the gunboat and the schoolbook legend? It is this. A nation does not always lose its sovereignty to an invading army. Sometimes it loses it to a transaction. Columbia was never conquered. It was outmaneuvered by a fire sale price, a mailed postage stamp, a warship that simply sat in a harbor, and a recognition telegram sent in 3 days. By the time anyone in Bogota understood what had happened, every decision that mattered had already been made in offices in New York and Washington by men doing arithmetic. The order of operations is the whole story. First, the product no one else could buy, then the price cut, then the route fight, then the rejection, then the revolution, then the treaty, then the warrant. The canal came last. The ledger came first. And the reckoning came slowly, which is its own kind of confession. In 1921, the Thomson-Arusha Treaty had the United States pay Colombia $25 million, with an earlier clause expressing American sincere regret quietly removed before ratification, a payment without an apology. Then the long correction, the Torrijos-Carter treaties signed on the 7th of September 1977 by Omar Torrijos and Jimmy Carter superseded the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty at last. The canal zone was abolished, and on December 31, 1999, full control of the canal passed to Panama. It took nearly a century to give back what had been taken in an afternoon. You are living inside the same machine. When a nation's fate is decided not by its own people in a room but by outside interests with a product to move and a deadline to meet. When sovereignty is treated as a line item to be negotiated around rather than a right to be respected. When the decisive act is a payment routed through a private bank while the affected people arrive 2 hours too late, that is not history. That is a pattern, still running today, wherever a strategic asset is worth more than the consent of the people who live on top of it. The stamp changes, the warrant changes, the bank changes its name, the logic does not. So let me leave you with the question the plaque refuses to ask. If the strongest argument for taking the canal was that America built it better than anyone else could, and America genuinely did, then why did the whole thing have to begin with a bankrupt company, a French shareholder posing as a Panamanian? Minister, a $40 million check, and a treaty no Panamanian ever signed? Tell me in the comments, was Theodore Roosevelt a builder who did what had to be done, or a buyer who invented a country to close a sale? Drop the word warrant below so I know you made it to the end. I read every one. And if this is the kind of deep dive you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely makes a bigger difference than you might think, and it keeps this work coming. I'll see you in the next one.